Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is an action role-playing first-person shooter, or rather a looter shooter, developed by Gearbox Software and published by 2K. The game was developed during the pandemic and released in March of 2022. It's a spin-off of the popular Borderlands franchise and a sequel in spirit to a DLC for Borderlands 2 called Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, which is set within the world of a fantasy-themed tabletop role-playing game, similar to Dungeons & Dragons, for example. The Borderlands franchise has always been very embedded in pop culture and has acknowledged its existence as a medium of popular fiction amongst other video games, TV shows and movies, via referencing them in one form or another. The Borderlands franchise itself is set in a dystopian future where the player would choose a Vault Hunter, essentially one of the hero figures of the story, defeat alien creatures, bandits, evil corporations, etc., with the ultimate goal of saving humanity, or rather the good guys, but more importantly, getting awesome loot in the process. Funnily, a standout feature of this franchise has always been the millions and millions of possible weapons and other pieces of gear the player would be able to obtain. This feature was even heavily included in the marketing and trailers and previews. However, the purpose of this video essay is not to highlight guns and violence. I would like to observe the various levels of metafiction that are displayed in this video game, because there are plenty. So many in fact that they completely transform the experience the player has, and I will explain why that is. In order to do so, I will first examine the different layers of narrative Wonderlands has to offer, with special attention directed towards some optional side quests, which perfectly encapsulate the level of detail and appreciation Wonderlands shows to other forms of literature and fiction. After that, I will briefly illustrate its relationship to Dungeons & Dragons and to a broader background of fantasy games. As I've already mentioned, the Borderlands franchise is set in a dystopian sci-fi setting, and as a spin-off/sequel, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is set in an imaginative fantasy tabletop role-playing world. In a way, this circumstance forms the first layer of the narrative. The player, in this case the newbie, a nickname for beginner or new guy, is on a spaceship together with Valentine, Fred and Tina. However, this spaceship has somehow crashed into a rock and is currently without enough fuel to get anywhere. Or so we believe. So the before-mentioned characters are waiting for help and gather around the table to play bunkers and badasses, their version of Dungeons & Dragons. For the sake of the narrative, Tina occupies the role of the bunker master, e.g. game master, while Valentine, Fred and the newbie take control of the characters. Tina begins to tell the story, the second layer of the narrative, which means that she sets the scene and narrates the game. As she begins, Valentine, Fred and the newbie are about to fight the Dragon Lord, who uses his magical abilities to raise the undead. Seemingly out of nowhere, Queen Batstallion appears with the Sword of Souls in hand, or rather in hoof, and defeats and imprisons the Dragon Lord. This causes a mild confusion amongst the players, which Tina quickly circumvents into a new adventure with all new characters, because it's the newbie's first time playing. This is where the game essentially begins. After creating your Fate Maker, the newbie ventures through the starting area with the help of Batstallion until they are stopped by a group of skeletons and their leader, who plans to free the Dragon Lord once again. Although the newbie is able to defeat the skeleton, the Dragon Lord is awakened and manages to disappear. So the newbie's journey continues in Brighthoof, the main hub of the game, which is currently under siege by the forces of evil. After defeating the Dragon Lord's minions, the newbie receives a new quest and is tasked to retrieve the Sword of Souls from a nearby graveyard. Once this is accomplished and the sword charged with the soul of the Zombos, the newbie comes back to the main square of Brighthoof and returns the sword to the central fountain and thus manages to repair the town. However, before Queen Batstallion is able to knight the newbie for their loyal efforts, the Dragon Lord appears, takes the sword and decapitates the queen before he teleports back to the pyramid with the sword and the queen's head in his hands. The new objective for the newbie is now to cross the ocean, reach the Dragon Lord's lair and stop him once and for all, before he manages to destroy the Wonderlands. In order to cross the ocean, however, the newbie needs to find a bard to bless their boat, unless they want to risk getting killed by a monster in the ocean. So they venture to find the bard in a nearby forest, who aims to dispel the bad vibes that have formed around the group of players. These vibes have manifested during table talks in which Valentine, Fred and Tina have argued over how they should play the game.
Okay, vibe check, vibe check. How's the party feeling?
I'm great. I'd be even better if Valentine hadn't gotten Queen Diamond Loot killed.
Whoa! How was that my fault? And why do you care? You can't even remember her name!
If we'd gone pillaging like I said, maybe we could have stopped the Dragon Lord. But no, you wanted to play hero.
Okay, vibes are good. Super good vibes. No need to check further vibes.
Uh-oh. Trouble in the party. Be careful.
In these moments, they begin to break the fourth wall, as they talk over the events of the game, which sometimes causes the world to alter drastically, in the spur of the moment. One example of this would be when Tina quickly changes her mind about certain enemies, terrain objects, or even the motivation of non-playable characters. With the help of the bard and some music, the characters manage to open up about their feelings, or rather their preferences when it comes to playing by the rules, and the story continues. Unfortunately, instead of a blessing, the good ship Balzania receives a blasting, and the bard casts magic missile and simply destroys the ocean. This moment marks an interesting point in the story, as the Dragon Lord directly addresses the player via some Galadriel to Frodo kind of telepathy and reveals that he is aware that Wonderlands is just a game and born of Tina's imagination. His plan is to harvest enough soul energy to use the Sword of Souls to sever Tina's control over the Wonderlands because he deems her unfit to rule them because of her impulsivity and her emotions. This is only one of several instances in the game where a character directly addresses not only the player, but also the construction of the plot. However, because this happens so naturally in the setting and almost frequently, it is not something that takes the player out of the moment, but rather immerses him or her further into the narrative, because it is so authentic and fitting. Given that Wonderlands is a game about playing a game, it really makes sense for the characters to talk about their quest, since it is actively encouraged for them to communicate with each other throughout the design of the quests and the overall, meaning the first and second layers, of the narrative. Once the newbie reaches the pyramid, the Dragon Lord, in a shocking twist, reveals his backstory and tells the newbie that he used to be the Dragon Knight, Tina's personal character, when she was first introduced to bunkers and badasses. Unfortunately, Tina used the Sword of Souls to defeat all evil, which in turn caused the Dragon Knight to become evil himself and turn into the Dragon Lord. This turn of events frustrated Tina, and she swore to play only as a bunker master from this point onward, so she could maintain control, thus creating the Wonderland, a world where only heroes would win, and the Dragon Lord, as a reoccurring villain, would always lose. However, once the Dragon Lord noticed his actions were not his own, he swore vengeance, which led to the earlier events of the story. Because of the game's pace and the build-up anticipation, the group is eager to defeat the villain and free the Wonderlands. But Tina, as a person, is afraid that Valentine, Fred and the newbie will leave her once they are done playing. So Tina tries to stall the ending. But the other characters are getting weary of her deliberate postponing of the inevitable, i.e. the confrontation with the Dragon Lord. When they ask her what she's doing, she scrambles to find a believable excuse.
It's cleansed. Feeling the way forward.
Yeah, I think I'm done with these hexes now.
I just want to get to the boss.
What? No need to rush. We're having fun. Hey! Well, roadblock. We're gonna have to go
Are you padding out the campaign so that we'll stay here and play bunkers and badasses with you?
No. The ancient catacombs are an integral part of the narrative. So who's laughing now? Valentine? Huh? It's me. Ha!
And the Dragon Lord uses this opportunity once again to point out how controlling and impulsive Tina is and urges the player to change their point of view. However, after reaching the top of the pyramid and defeating the Dragon Lord, Tina, Valentine and Fred encourage the newbie to use the Sword of Souls to end the villain once and for all. But rather than killing him, the newbie uses the soul energy to revive Queen Badstallion. Delighted about the happy ending and their shared time playing, Fred, Valentine and Tina promise to continue with the game. This leads into the epilogue, in which the newbie is able to continue finishing side quests, explore the overworld and remaining dungeons on the map, or try their skills in the Chaos Chambers, Wonderlands endgame content. For the purposes of this video, neither the endgame nor the post-launch content is relevant. Rather than to address the game's mechanics, I would like to illustrate the game's design and world building. In keeping with the traditions of Dungeons & Dragons, Wonderlands features an interactive overworld, the tabletop to the video game in a way. Unlike the previous Borderlands games, Wonderlands features a map that connects not only various areas on a map, but also elements of the plot. While walking the overworld, the newbie's character is displayed as a more traditional figurine with a bobbly head. Rather than an empty canvas to traverse, however, the overworld is filled with NPCs, shrines and other objects that one can engage with, which further immerses the player in the world and its setting. In keeping with the chaotic traditions of Tiny Tina, however, her idea of an overworld is littered with peanut flips, bottle caps, and other everyday objects, as well as a very diverse set of characters. Now, let's take a look at what I would consider the third narrative layer, the side quests. I've played through Wonderlands twice now, and I'm sure that I have yet to notice every reference to another show, movie, book, or video game. As I've mentioned, it's a tradition of the Borderlands franchise to reference other mediums of fiction, but not to the degree that Wonderlands does. In the past, such a reference would have been a quest, an NPC, or maybe just an item or its description. This is still true for Wonderlands, but there are also examples in which a reference becomes a whole level, a major questline, or a reference crossover. While playing, I've noticed several references to Die Hard, A Knight's Tale, King Arthur, The Tooth Fairy, The Smurfs, Star Wars, Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk, Don Quixote, The Hobbit, Moby Dick, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Pinocchio, Indiana Jones, Captain Hook, The Witcher, Mambo No. 5, Mario Brothers, and The Fifth Element. However, in my opinion, the most notable of these must be Jack and the Beanstalk, Don Quixote, and Pinocchio. Let's start with the first of the three. Once the ocean has been defeated, the newbie journeys into the former depth of the ocean and discovers a magic bean that urges him to find a proper place for it. Once it is planted, the bean explodes into a huge magical beanstalk, and thus an entire level is formed. This is not only an incredible show of love towards the original material, but also an exciting playground for us to discover, since the level is full of vertical elements that show how massive the beanstalk has become and it has affected the citizens of the town which was uprooted. Additionally, this becomes an area full of additional side quests and even multiple boss fights. Most remarkable, however, is the fact that this entire section is completely optional. Much like all the other side quests in this game, and many others, the player is able to walk straight past the magic bean, ignore the highlighted exclamation mark on the map, and simply continue with the main quest. In many cases, this is a reality. Even in the previous entries in the Borderlands franchise, it was commonplace for me to skip the occasional side quest when I didn't feel compelled to do it. Unfortunately, if the game's design isn't inviting enough, or the characters interesting enough, or the loot promising enough, the player can simply grind another area of the map for some experience and leave this content undiscovered. In Wonderlands, however, I felt compelled to complete every side quest because I was curious to find out what reference would come next. In some cases, such as the Smurf quest, there were even references within references, and some of them were truly absurd. But this shows how passionate and creative the developers are. According to Patricia Wow, these references tell a story to those who recognize them, and that is fascinating to me, because that means that every side quest is a potential branch for the story to unfold in different ways. In other words, somebody who is unfamiliar with some of these classic pieces of literature, such as Jack and the Beanstalk or Don Quixote, has an entirely different experience than somebody who is familiar with them. So if I ever decide to replay Wonderlands a third time, there is a chance for me to discover something new which would add another layer of meaning to the game from my point of view. Considering the likely age range of the target audience of a modern ARPG with a comic style, I find it rather daring of the developers to include such a diverse set of references, given how odd some of them seem, like Don Quixote for example. Even the other characters, like Valentine, Fred and Tina, talk about this random NPC, even at length. And that shows how precious this part must have been to the developers and directors of the game. From their standpoint, it is expensive to have 3 famous voice actors record additional lines for an optional side quest that many players might even miss. I have to say that I respect their dedication, and I believe that Wonderlands really shines in this aspect compared to the other entries in the Borderlands franchise. To highlight some of Wonderlands' similarities to Dungeons & Dragons and its background as a fantasy game, I've included some excerpts and background footage of a short documentary from the Wired YouTube channel, which is called Inside the 40-year-long Dungeons & Dragons game.
While fantasy role-playing and nerd culture are often celebrated today, Robert's campaign started during a time when people felt like they needed to play in secret.
In the 80s and 90s, it was certainly more difficult to try to talk about or explain the game to people. I grew up in a very small town, and it was quite a conservative town. And so the town inevitably found out that we were playing, and they didn't know what the heck we were doing. And Dungeons & Dragons had very bad press at the time.
Tonight we begin with a story about make-believe adventure and real-life violence, and what some critics fear is a connection between the two in a game called Dungeons & Dragons.
A movie came out while we were playing called Mazes and Monsters, and it's a story of how they play this game and then they try to act it out in real life, and basically bad things certainly happen.
Can you tell me of the giant dragon? On my travels here, I heard him.
What's now called the Satanic Panic was going on at the time. Why does my son want to play this game all the time? Why is he obsessed about it? What are you doing to him? Are you a cult leader? I got called a cult leader, a communist, like all these crazy labels. When I watched Stranger Things, it obviously hit home for me.
It is almost here. What is it?
What if it's the Demogorgon? Oh, Jesus, we're so screwed if it's the Demogorgon.
It's not the Demogorgon.
The whole concept matched exactly what we were doing.
From the beginning, Robert quickly learned which rules could be bent and which rules could be broken.
When we started playing, there was probably a short period of time when I played according to the actual rules, but after that I had to fill in holes, and so I developed my own rule system, and I've never really gone back. So I have what gamers would call a homebrew rule system. And actually that's how the game was intended. When the game first came out, one of the lines in the Dungeon Master Guide told you that these are a set of rules, but to apply these loosely. And within my game and my world, there are all kinds of different aspects that you wouldn't see in an ordinary Dungeons & Dragons rule system. My rules are fast, they're quick flowing. I think there's an assumption that at some point we're all going to grow up and we're going to stop playing games. And so people always say, how does your game end? How's it going to end? And it's like, well, my answer is always, how does the world end? How is your world going to end? And well, it's probably going to end when I die. Well, for you it is, right? And so the answer is largely the same. It's much like life. More than anything else, the game represents friendship.
In these excerpts, the history professor and D&D game master, Robert Wardor, speaks about his experiences with the game, its history, and his motivation to keep playing. I've decided to include this footage because it shows how passionate Professor Wardor is about playing the game and maintaining an incredibly high creative standard for himself and his players. I believe that his dedication is exemplary for some of the projects in the gaming and fantasy industry, and this extends to the greater literary cosmos that they've become a part of. This leads me to my conclusion for this video. While I am not unaware that Wonderlands has not satisfied many of the Borderlands franchise's core players, who put endgame content above anything else, I think that Wonderlands towers over the other entries. Like I've mentioned earlier, I think that its compelling and human narrative, its humor, and its world building are incredibly creative and satisfying. Over the course of most of this video essay, I have talked about the different layers of narrative and how they affect each other, how the player's actions affect the table talk, how it creates an authentic D&D experience, and how deep Wonderlands is embedded in its cultural environment, which ranges from contemporary shows and games to classical pieces of literature. And I must praise the writers, the performers, and the developers for their achievement. Wonderlands is so full of metafictional references that they completely transform and elevate the traditional ARPG experience.